Why is Reagan silent about AIDS? What is really going on at the CDC, the FDA, and the Vatican? Gays and lesbians are not expendable. Use your power, vote, boycott, defend yourselves. Turn anger, fear, grief into action. Those words lie underneath the now iconic phrase, silence equals death. The poster, with its upside-down pink triangle, was a rallying cry and arguably one of the most recognizable and influential works of protest art in history. It's become a defining image of ACT UP, but I think it's worth noting that the poster itself, it pre-existed the organization. It was born out of weekly dinners with Brian Howard, Oliver Johnston, Charles Kraloff, Chris Leone, Jorge Sakaras, and Avram Finkelstein. The six men gathered to talk and to figure out what does it mean to be gay in the age of AIDS. Avram was one of the members of that group and is our guest today. He eventually became a founding member of ACT UP, where he helped to push silence equals death into the national consciousness. Today, we talk about the creation of that first poster, about Avram's work with Gran Fury, that's the artist collective that emerged in ACT UP, and why he says that ACT UP was much, much more radical than we remember today. I'm Jeffrey Masters, and this is LGBT Q&A with Avram Finkelstein, recorded last month at his home in New York. So I'm going to begin in the 80s. I know that your partner Don got sick in the early days of the crisis. Was it 81 or so he started showing symptoms?
I think 80, but I think actually 1979 probably is more accurate. I say 1980 because that's when my mother acknowledged or saw that he was immunocompromised.
Oh, I see. So I feel like when we tell the story of the AIDS crisis, we typically start with the formation of ACT UP, because it's just a bit easier to say things were bad and then we responded, right? So that was 1987, ACT UP began. Your partner's sick, 79, 80.
He dies in 84.
84. And so how are you, the pre-ACT UP era, how are you thinking about AIDS?
I mean, I think the thing is, nobody knew how to talk about it, when to talk about it, or wanted to talk about it. And there were all of these kind of coy codes for talking about it. You don't look well. Did you lose weight? These were the kinds of questions that people would ask instead of, are you sick? Or if somebody was dying, people would say, oh, I hear he's not well, or I hear he's sick, but they wouldn't say what with. But I think there was a high level of ignorance, but there was also a social ineptitude. And it's weird to think that in Manhattan, I traveled in art and music and fashion circles. Of all of the people in the world, you would think would be equipped to actually have a conversation. And after Don died, one of my closest friends, Lori Goldstein, she took me to dinner after Don died, and I was like Greek epic theater rage and despair. And I could see her rearing back in her chair, and it was the last time I ever saw her, spoke to her. It was too much. It was just a complicated moment, and nobody knew what an appropriate response to any of it, personally, politically, socially, might be.
I see.
I think that there are many things that we don't talk about. Queerness was one of them. AIDS was one of them.
Well, as you said, Don died in 1984, and you label not his death, but specifically his parents' response to his death as what politicized you as a gay man. Will you explain what happened?
Well, I think what I said was it connected my politics to my being gay. I don't think that my parents responded any more appropriately than Don's parents did. But up until the point when Don got sick, and I think this is what happened with both of our families, my mother thought that Don was going to infect me, or that I was infected. And Don's parents thought I had given Don AIDS. They didn't know that Don used to have sex with people in New York subway bath stations. There used to be bathrooms in subway stations in New York. So they couldn't cognate they were perfectly comfortable and adoring, perfectly comfortable with Don being gay and adoring of me being his partner. And we were inseparable, and I spent a lot of time with his family. And I think literally days after Don died, they came to my apartment to collect everything that was Don's, all of his masters for his recordings that they didn't have, other ephemera, things I had given Don.
And this is without your consent. Right?
I was, there was a spiral staircase. I was on the staircase in tears the entire time as his two brothers and I think one of his sisters and his two parents literally ransacked my apartment. And I was there with Chris Leone from the Silence Equals Death Collective, who I met through Don. Chris knew they were coming and wanted to prevent them from doing what they ended up doing. But he was consoling me. And it was literally like locusts sweeping across a savannah. They were in and out in a half hour, and it was done. It was horrible.
Wow. And so after he died, you formed the collective that became Silence Equals Death. And the poster came out of that. However, that was not the initial purpose of the group. What did you guys initially begin meeting for?
Well, so Jorge Salcaraz, who I had known for several years, came to, after Don died, invited me to dinner and brought Oliver Johnston, who I did not know, with him. And the three of us were having dinner and talking about other people we knew. And at a certain point, we decided that we needed a place to consider what being gay in the age of AIDS meant. And that was the phrase we actually used when we decided we needed to do that. And I said, I think we should form a consciousness-raising group, because I come from a political family and knew women in the feminist movement who were in consciousness-raising groups. I knew how they functioned and what they were for. So I suggested we form a consciousness-raising group. And I said, in order for us to have a challenging conversation or a productive one, it shouldn't all be people that we know. So I think each of us should invite one person the other two don't know. I invited Chris Leone. Oliver invited Charles Kraloff, and Jorge invited Brian Howard. And that was the collective. But we met every week at a different person's apartment, and we would spend pretty much the entire first part of the evening talking about fears of sex. We were afraid we were going to die alone. We were afraid we were going to die. We didn't know how to talk about it with anyone. We would frequently bring in clippings to help orient what the topics might be. And during that part of the evening, which was always the tail end, we would end up talking about the politics of AIDS. And there wasn't really any place in New York. There were tons of AIDS service organizations, not tons, but everyone knew the ones that existed. But there was no political organizing. So because of my experience with postering especially after the May 68 student strikes in France, but also throughout the student mobilization against the war in Vietnam, I was very aware of the use of posters. And in fact, that's how people communicated when I was a teenager. We used the streets. So it became obvious to me there was something missing. There was no public conversation about the politics of AIDS. So I thought, well, let's just make a poster. let's make a fucking poster and see if it leads anywhere.
I mean, one of the themes of this conversation has been like talking about AIDS with coded language, this silence, and of course, silence equals death. But how did that phrase come up in the meeting itself?
I ran across a very trite phrase. It's trite now and is probably was trite then, in a New York Times article about it wasn't about AIDS, it was about something else, about silence being deafening. And I had written it in my journal. And in the final meeting, final meeting of 1986, where we decided what the poster was going to be, we were tossing around ideas as we did. We didn't work on the poster all meeting, every meeting for the entire year of 1986, but pretty much for 9 months, I would say we worked on the poster at some point during the meeting and argued about it and fought about it and had ideas and discarded them. Anyway, at this meeting, which was at Jorge's, his apartment was on 5th Street right off Avenue A, and we were talking about the poster, and I read out of my journal, I saw this thing in the Times. I'm not sure about it, but it kind of struck a chord for me. The silence is deafening. And someone else, the volley literally lasted as quickly as I'm saying it to you now. I read this thing, silence is deafening. Someone else said, oh no, it should be silence is death. And then someone else said, no, it should be silence equals death. And then someone just immediately after that said, oh no, it should be an equal sign. And we all screamed because we had decided we were going to use a pink triangle, but we didn't have the tagline. And whenever you have a poster on the streets of New York in particular, you're in contested space. There's lots of other visual information. So you need something to draw you into the poster, and that's what we were missing. And that line came out of this 15 to 20 second volley.
What did it feel like to see the poster up for the first time?
I don't think I paid close attention to that question. I was more concerned with whether it was efficacious. And my mother came to visit me on 42nd Street and passed by one of the posters that they had put up, and she didn't know I had done it. And when we were talking about it, and I told her about it, she said, oh, I saw that poster. And my mother was a Marxist and given to hyperbole, and I wouldn't say melodramatic, but she said, I saw it and I thought it's like the shot heard around the world. And I think that was the first time I paid attention to its impact because there was no way to gauge its impact.
Sure. That's very encouraging.
Yeah. Well, yes, if one relies on their parents for approbation, but I was raised to be independent, although I had tremendous respect for my mother. Her saying that seemed hyperbolic, but yes, it was encouraging.
And so soon after that, ACT UP forms. You're there at the first meeting. What was it like to go from working in a group of 6 people to a group with like 300?
Well, it wasn't 300 until after the first presence at the first Pride March in summer.
Oh, I thought 300 were the first meeting. No. How many were at the first meeting?
50.
Oh, okay.
100 on a good night.
Okay.
No, literally, I didn't find out until having a subsequent conversation with somebody that actually Larry had called a whole bunch of people to come to that meeting. I did not know that. So there were a certain amount of people who were there because of Larry, and I brought the Silence Equals Death Collective to that meeting that was the meeting at which ACT UP being formed was just suggested.
Yeah.
So I said to the collective, instead of dinner at someone's house. Let's meet and hear Larry talk, because Larry was the only one talking about the politics of AIDS. I said, maybe he will say something, like we should go there. And it was at that meeting that it was decided that we would meet later that week, and that was the formation of ACT UP. And I have notes from that very first meeting, and I think what's noteworthy about that conversation was, so Larry did his didactic, like, you're all fucked up, we're all going to die, you're going to be to blame. He made half of the room stand up, and then he was like, you'll all be dead, and what are we going to, and then he was like, what are we going to do about it? And I think he had given that talk many times, perhaps, and was accustomed to no one responding. People were jumping out of their chairs, hands shot up everywhere. And I took notes on the things that people were suggesting that we do. And they were block every bridge and tunnel, stop the New York Times trucks from leaving the bays, demonstrate at the Food and Drug Administration. Like, everything that ACT UP went on to do was suggested by a room full of strangers on that first night. And I don't think Larry was prepared for that response. And I think that when people in hindsight think about the AIDS crisis and AIDS activism, they think of it as like this lightning bolt from the sky. It was a slow motion train wreck. It was years of people hiding and whispering and not knowing what to do, working at service organizations. It was inevitable that something would trigger an activist response.
So when did you see that it was this group, ACT UP, when did you see that it was so effective? Because it very well could have been one meeting and then nothing ever happens.
Well, that was a slow process. But for instance, I had all these ideas about communications, and when I knew there was going to be an AIDS walk, I was sitting next to someone who was in the ROTC. He was a kind of a cute guy. I was sitting next to him because I thought he was cute. His name was Mike Savino. I didn't know him very well. Marie Mannion, who was kind of a power dyke from the East End of Long Island, was the facilitator that night. And Savino raised his hands at some point in the meeting and said, don't you think we should have a fundraising committee to raise money to pay for the printing of flyers? And Marie was a seasoned facilitator, said, great, so you will take responsibility for forming the fundraising committee. And after the meeting was over, Savino looked at me and he was like, I don't know anything about fundraising. I said, actually, I have an idea. So I knew that I had already priced making Silence Equals Death buttons. I knew that the AIDS walk was happening in May. So this meeting would have been mid-March, early April. I said, buttons are 18 cents a piece. I've already sourced where we can have them made. I was thinking about what we would do prior to ACT UP forming, like what our next steps might be as a collective. So I said, I'll pay for a run of 1,000 buttons. We'll sell them at, it was $180. I will front the money and produce them, have them produced, and we will sell them at the AIDS Walk. And I wasn't thinking about fundraising. I was thinking about 1,000 walking billboards. The poster was already coming down off the streets of New York. I was thinking about next steps. I was thinking about creating 1,000 activists. And we sold every single button.
I mean, I have to say, I think that the majority of ACT UP, there was women and people of color, but the majority was gay white men. Is that right?
Yes, I would say the majority was, but that invisibilizes the people of color and women who were in ACT UP, who were very essential members of ACT UP.
Yeah, not to demean them in any way, but you mentioned talking about women and people of color and how they're affected by AIDS. And I bring that up because it is very apparent in, like for example, I'll read the Reagan Gate poster, AIDS Gate. It says, 54% of people with AIDS in New York City are Black or Hispanic. AIDS is the number one killer of women between the ages of 24 and 29 in New York City. By 1991, more people have died of AIDS than in the entire Vietnam War. What is Reagan's policy on AIDS? Genocide of all non-white, non-males, and non-heterosexuals? Silence equals death. And I just think, like, there are so many groups that have large numbers of, like, gay white men, frankly, in our history that just don't have put that big of an emphasis on women and people of color, speaking frankly. So it stands out.
Well, I think if you read the subtext of that poster, yes, it was very intentional. When the original poster, prior to it being the Silence Equals Death poster, was kickstarted by a very pernicious editorial in the New York Times by William F. Buckley Jr., in which he called for people with HIV to be tattooed. And when we were thinking about, so that was going to be what the poster was about, but it eventually morphed into what it ended up being. But when we were thinking about what that poster might look like, we were thinking, okay, well, if you depict a tattoo on a body, what gender is that body? What color is that body? That's how we ended up with the pictographic solution, because all of the data were indicating that women and people of color were being impacted as well. So we were very plugged into this idea before ACT UP formed.
And you continue to make posters and art with ACT UP with Gran Fury, the artist collective formed inside ACT UP. Some of the posters, had the Pope on it, had an erect penis on it. Like, what did you learn about, like, what worked and did not work?
So Tom Kalin and Gran Fury used to go around and photograph our work on the streets so we could study the homophobic graffiti or the responses, and then refine our messaging. So we tried, like the Silence Equals Death Collective, we tried many things. And the things one might be familiar with, Gran Fury's greatest hits, there were as many failures as there were hits, and you'd have to be a student of art to know them.
Gran Fury did agitprop, like aggressive propaganda. Were there ideas that were just, like, too aggressive that you rejected?
Well, there was an idea for a poster I had that Gran Fury wouldn't do because they thought it was politically retrograde, and it was the Enjoy AZT poster. And the reason why Gran Fury didn't want to do it, and it was Tom Kalin basically who was like, no, we're not doing that, was because AZT, even though it was fairly ineffective and in fact poisonous, and the most expensive drug in the history of America, it was the only drug available to people living with HIV and AIDS. And Tom was like, I don't feel comfortable taking pot shots at it. I was visiting my friend Edward Moore in San Francisco. The first city where Kissing Doesn't Kill showed up was in San Francisco. And I happened to be in a street corner with a camera in my hand because I had never been to San Francisco. And a trolley went by with the Kissing Doesn't Kill poster on the side of it.
And just for the people listening, there's a couple iterations. One had two sailors logging lips.
That is, read my lips. I'm talking about Kissing Doesn't Kill,
is
which
this
was
three kissing faces? Or 6 people kissing?
Yes.
Okay,
correct.
great. Sorry.
Which is based on that.
Okay, so like 2 male couples, 1 female couple, all different races kissing, and it says kissing doesn't kill.
Heterosexual couple, a female couple, and a male couple.
I'll get there eventually.
Yeah. This trolley goes by, streetcar goes by, and every couple but the non-lesbian couple was spray painted out with white paint. So I was like, some lesbian graffiti artist appropriated this. I was so thrilled by it, and I took a picture of it. And then there is the graffiti in Chicago where there was an alderman who was so offended by the same-sex couples kissing, and also the mixed race couple, the heterosexual couple is mixed race, that they organized a graffiti campaign where they painted it out with black paint. So I think that both of those juxtapositions, the white out and the black out of this one work, and the work was censored by AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. When we originally proposed it, it had the tagline, so it was "Kissing doesn't kill, greed and indifference do," and the three couples kissing. The tagline was corporate greed, public indifference, and corporate greed, public indifference, and government inaction make AIDS a political crisis. We were really happy with it. When we went to propose the final work to Art Against AIDS on the Road, they're like, no, you can't say corporate greed because we're seeking pharmaceutical company money. We're AMFAR. No. So I wanted to walk, but Mark Simpson, who was also at the meeting, was like, I was like, we're not doing this. And Mark was like, interrupted me, and I was a hothead. Mark said, actually, we need to discuss this as a collective. And we did discuss it as a collective. Several people noted that there were no images of same-sex couples kissing in America ever. There hadn't even been a same-sex kiss on television.
And what year is this? Like late 80s?
1987, ACT UP formed. 1988, Gran Fury formed. This poster project was designed in the summer, but didn't hit the streets until the end of 88 into 1989.
So having huge poster advertisements with queer couples kissing was radical.
It seemed important to other members of the collective, and I wasn't about to block it. And many years later, I did a talk, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said that when they were growing up, they saw that poster and it saved their life. So I realized that A, I'm not always right, and B, images have power, and you can't always determine or imagine what the power is. But it's my personal feeling that no form of intervention is irrelevant. All of it has meaning. You can't know what the meaning is or control what the meaning is in late-stage capitalism, but not articulating your agency is a one-way street to nowhere. That's how I feel about activism in general and communicating in public spaces, for sure.
Can I ask, Gran Fury was the artist collective in ACT UP. Why was the decision made to like at the bottom of the poster to sign them all as Gran Fury and not just ACT UP?
So you're asking questions that involve very long answers. So,
Sorry.
It became obvious. So Gran Fury was formed as an open committee in ACT UP, and people would come and go, and sometimes they would go away on vacation and not come back for a month, and someone would come to the next meeting, and something you decided the meeting before would be thrown up in the air. It became very obvious to us that we would have to close the committee at some point. So up until that point, we were going to the floor of ACT UP to request money for the printing of certain things or the production costs of all of the 9 days of actions. So instead of going to the floor, it became cumbersome. And then you'd get to the floor of ACT UP and people would be like, oh, I don't think that's a good idea, or I don't think we should support that. And then the next week, everyone would be into it. So we decided it was impossible for us to work as a collective unless we closed it as a collective. And it was at that point, we were signing it Gran Fury, but it was at that point it became a closed committee.
Oh, because I would just assume ACT UP would kind of want that branding, for lack of a better word.
Would want? Or
would, yeah.
No, I think that here's the thing about the agitprop that's associated with ACT UP, that it's come to define the way we think about the AIDS historiography. There were people in ACT UP who worked at video stores. There were cater waiters. There were people who worked in nurses in hospitals. There were people who didn't work at all. There were artists, there were writers, but there were people in the sciences, but most people had no experience making visual work. And They basically thought that the posters rained down from the sky. Larry Kramer had no idea, like, who made what or what the differences were or why anything was made. So I think the relationship between ACT UP and the visual agitprop that has come to represent it is so skewed by scholars and journalists and academics and activists and people who write the history of activism, who have inserted a certain level of meaning making that didn't exist on the floor of ACT UP, which is an organism at best.
And going back to silence equals death, you said you put it on pins. You also eventually made shirts. You did posters. It has become a symbol of ACT UP. And frankly, before I read your book, I just thought ACT UP created that phrase. I didn't know that it was created beforehand. You guys brought it to it. But you pushed that phrasing, silence equals death, into the public consciousness by like the repetition of the posters, the shirts, the buttons. When did you start to see it take on a life of its own?
Well, people were dying in hospital hallways, so I was more concerned with the activist work and pushing for change that would save people's lives than I was what you're asking about. No one in Gran Fury had even seen the 4 questions poster, which happened after Gran Fury officially folded, and it was a splinter group made up of several members. And nobody had kept any posters. I was the only one who had, in that flat file, are multiple copies of Silence Equals Death, AIDS Gate.
These are the original posters behind us?
All the Gran Fury work, the Lesbian Avengers work, like Boys with Arms Akimbo. Like, I did not believe in history. I thought history was bullshit. And I'm not a pack rat. I mean, you can see the apartment is full, but this is an entire life's worth of work. You are not looking at the many, many things I just threw out. I'm a purger, actually.
Wait, sorry. What do you mean you do not believe in history?
I think I came to believe because, and I don't believe in the art world either. Like, I have come to believe in the corruption of historiography, the teaching of history. Even as a child, I was aware that whole things were being written out of what I was told. So it's not that I don't believe in history. I don't believe that late-stage American capitalism understands the meaning of history or can cope with the ramifications of history. So that's what I mean by it's bullshit. What I'm saying is late-stage American capitalism is bullshit. So I think it's noteworthy that no one in any of the art collectives I was involved with kept anything.
Oh, I understand.
We did not make it to become fetish objects for study over decades. We made it to save people's lives. And if something didn't work, we would be like, well, that didn't work. Let's try this.
That's interesting. You mentioned the 4 questions. One of the final, was it the final poster after?
It was the last poster, but there were 2 other projects that we did after that.
I want to read those questions. There's a white poster, and it says, "Do you resent people with AIDS? Do you trust HIV negatives? Have you ever given up hope for a cure? When was the last time you cried?" Will you talk to me about that last question?
So if you notice on that poster, the Gran Fury is tiny because we were trying to indicate that this wasn't a Gran Fury poster, but it was kind of a Gran Fury poster. The poster came about because of the dissolution of Gran Fury. There were people who didn't want to continue to work anymore because they felt as though we were not being effective and we were failing too much. And we had lost our ability to actually do something productive. That also happened as ACT UP there was a schism in ACT UP between the treatment and data group and the ACT UP membership. It's when TAG was formed. So there was this conversation in the activist community after years of work and burnout that was causing all kinds of rifts. And one of the rifts was, should people who are not HIV positive be speaking for people who are HIV positive, which is not something that ever was, that wasn't a conversation that anyone was having prior to all of these rifts. Gran Fury didn't dissolve because of that rift, but Mark Simpson, who took his life a few years after this, was not prepared to dissolve Gran Fury. So I had this idea. Mark Simpson was raised by fundamentalist Christians in Texas. So he was the opposite of my upbringing as a New York Jew. But the circle of friends that I traveled in had Passover. And so Mark Simpson became very, very attached to the Passover celebration. And I still celebrate Passover with my affinity group of ACT UP because it's a political holiday, not because I'm in any way a religious Jew. I was raised as an atheist. We never celebrated Passover. I didn't celebrate Passover until ACT UP. But Mark knew Passover, and I knew Passover. And there the four questions in Passover. Why is this night different? Why do we lean on the table? I can't remember what the questions in the Haggadah are. But it seemed like a pretty good matrix to discuss the schism between HIV positive and HIV negative, which is what those first two questions are. Do you trust people who are HIV negative? Do you resent people with AIDS? So there were younger people who resented people who were older, my age, because we had lived in a world prior to AIDS and were able to have unsafe sex, and it wasn't a death sentence, which at a certain up until the protease inhibitors, AIDS was. So there were all kinds of questions about resentment and blame and misgivings and burnout. So those two questions address that. What's the third question?
Have you given up hope for a cure?
So the treatment and data, one of my big complaints was it became very clear that a curative might be possible, but to actually call for a cure it's not scientifically feasible. So there was a whole range of treatment activists who were moving away from that conversation, but I was not prepared to give up that ground. So that's what that is.
That question was pointed back at ACT UP.
At AIDS activists and at treatment activists and at political activists and at the community. This was a cri de coeur. And the last question, when was the last time you cried? Like when we were crafting these sentences, these lines of text, it was within certain circles in ACT UP, it was becoming apparent that burnout was overpowering our efficacy. And so that was a throwdown to the question of like, okay, we're strong, we're moving ahead, we're fighting for everyone's life, we're concerned with our ethics and efficacy. But when was the last time you cried? What about that part of it? Like we were so sick of burying people. And of course, everyone cried all the time. But the question, when was the last time you cried, seemed like a political question to ask.
I see. This kind of, the posters, like political art, nowadays it exists primarily online. Like, what do you think we lose when it's not in a public space like that?
Well, online is a public space. It's a different public
Sure.
space. But
but it's also more temporary, right?
Well, potentially. There is nothing so threatening as seeing something in a physical space in front of you. I had this idea of dyeing every fountain in Washington, D.C. red, and found a naval dye marker and did logistics checks. We couldn't figure out how to make it work. But the idea being, you can write letters, you can do demonstrations, you can shake your fists at a building with offices in it. But if every fountain in your city is blood red, that changes the way you think about your culpability.
And you can't avoid it.
It's unavoidable. It becomes physical spaces have meaning because they have a relationship to corporeality that art in a museum does not have, a political poster in a museum doesn't have, a poster on the street does have. You have to walk up to it. And the Silence Equals Death, one of the ways that it functioned was the Silence Equals Death and the Pink Triangle were for the bus or the speeding car. The subtext was for the queer community. That was the political organizing text, and you have to walk up to it to read it. And because it's in a smaller point size, you're walking up to it, you are already activating your body. Like it's performative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the scrolling does not have that same relationship, but having an archive in your pocket is an efficacious means of communication. It is not irrelevant. It might be temporal, but so is a poster. The posters didn't last forever. They were washed out in the rain. So I think the idea that social spaces are more permanent and less ephemeral than digital spaces is a misapprehension of meaning making. And it's the content that moves politics, not the delivery device. Whether it's a broadsheet, a poster, on your pocket computer, on your laptop, it's irrelevant. It's what it says.
I see.
That has meaning.
And so these online, it's no less effective. It's just simply like a different means. Okay.
I don't think it is less effective. It is another thing. If you were to say that it's ineffective, you're basically saying an entire generation of digital natives have no correlation to their politics, and that's not true. That can't be true.
Yeah.
It's not true. It's just not true.
To my mind, people will disagree with me. I can't think of a easy comparison between ACT UP and any other group that's come since. And like the size and how effective ACT UP is completely shocking. Why do you think we've not seen a group like them since?
Well, I would have to disagree with you
completely.
I mean,
Tell me.
Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, like and internationally, there are many examples. What happened in Minnesota, it came in the night. I don't know that it disappeared, but it's certainly what happened in Minnesota has impacted America, has changed the way America thinks about what's happening politically.
I guess I was thinking those are like a shorter time frame. And
Well, ACT UP still meets every week, but it stopped being ACT UP probably by 1993, 1994. It stopped being that powerhouse. And I think if you're looking at Gran Fury, as another case study. If you look at Gran Fury's work product, almost everything Gran Fury did was designed within the first year of its existence and is a reimagining of something that was tried that didn't quite work or that was retried or re-evaluated. Read My Lips became Kissing Doesn't Kill. Like, if you think critically about it, the window of productivity of Gran Fury is much smaller even than the few years which its work is attributed to.
I guess I'm thinking about, frankly, today in 2026, what's happening to the trans community in the United States is horrifying. Every day a new state passes a new law that shocks you and how cruel they're able to be. And the ACLU is fighting back in courts. Different groups are trying different things, but there isn't not been an applicable ACT UP kind of a response to those threats.
Queer Art, the Queer Art Mentorship Program, is an ongoing, I don't know what year it's in, I've been involved with them for 5-6 years, is heavily trans-inflected performance, visual artists, people on the board, people who run it. I think there are many responses. There's room for many responses.
Yeah.
If what you're saying is there's ACT UP was this monolith that was gigantic, is a misapprehension of what ACT UP was.
But also ACT UP was able to like have policies be changed, right?
Yes.
I'm looking for a group that is like able to, change like monumentally like improve like trans lives in like 50 states. I think we're needing that.
I think we are too. Yes, for sure.
And I think what's like not comparable is that, everyone in ACT UP, from what I understand, is like if you didn't think you had HIV, you thought you were going to get it. And so everyone felt like their lives are on the line. And unfortunately, the entire LGBTQ community does not feel like they have their lives on the line. And so the response has been more tepid. That's my take.
No, I think you're right about it, but I think you're also right about gay. That also applies to gay rights. Like the idea that, so the way that capitalism functions, just because some rights are granted, doesn't mean they can't be taken away. Doesn't mean that it's not an object or a system in flux.
Yeah.
And I think the thing I always say about political activism is you don't have to be everywhere all the time. And if you need to step away, you put it down and somebody else picks it up. And that is the nature of activism and social change. The thing about your statement about ACT UP having made concrete policy changes, the fact of that ability to do that meant being invited into the system. It was also what neutralized ACT UP. So you could say, yes, concrete things happened when treatment activists became involved in treatment protocols at the NIH and the FDA. It's great that those things change, but it also meant that TAG spun off from ACT UP. So ACT UP lost its treatment action ability.
That makes sense.
Because it was neutralized by a system that was inviting them in. And anyone who has ever been an activist in any cause would tell you that that is how capitalism functions. You become neutralized by being given a seat at the table.
I see.
I think the part of ACT UP, the smiley face part of ACT UP, is protests work, drugs were approved, no one dies of AIDS, which is of course untrue. So the smiley face version of it ignores the more radical questions involved in it. That doesn't speak to the trans question, and I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good one, though.
Well, I don't think anybody does, because if we had an answer, we wouldn't have to talk
We wouldn't
about
be
it.
asking the question.
Yeah, because I don't know. I'm not the only one. People like to look to history for an example of how to confront the terrorists today, and there's not a lot of like perfectly applicable examples. So that's why I appreciate you engaging in the conversation. I do want to ask, when did you finally get tested for HIV?
So my longtime partner, who I'm no longer with and haven't been with for a long time, was in my affinity group. And my boyfriend had just taken his life, and I met this person who will remain unnamed within a few months after that. He was 10 years younger than I was. He was in his 20s. I was in my early 30s. So we assumed, because I had buried Don, I was HIV positive and he was HIV negative, and it would be irresponsible. Once we realized we were kind of thinking we were going to be a couple, we should be tested. So that would have been 1989, probably.
And were you surprised by the result?
We both were. He was HIV positive and I was HIV negative. Yeah, it was shocking, probably.
And that is just, it's a dumb question, but that's just like luck, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Don and I didn't have safe sex.
Yeah.
Safe sex didn't exist. But I think to go back to the question of why aren't people activists for trans rights? I was an HIV negative person fighting for HIV positive people and people with AIDS. I think it's possible to, if your consciousness is raised,
Of course.
to see it as your fight. And of course, any fight for autonomy and human rights is all of our fights. And I think because I'm older and I lecture and talk a lot, I deal with a lot of younger people who feel sheepish about talking about AIDS because they weren't even born when this happened. And I tend to say to them, or I like to say to them, no, I wasn't in the Holocaust. I was born after it happened, but it is my story. AIDS is everyone's story. It's your story. You do not have to have lived through it for it to be your story. You have to care about it for it to be your story. And that is true for race and for gender, for trans questions, for all of it. I think we ask the wrong question when we think that you have to be fully invested in order for something to be effective. I don't think that's true. Look at all the white people in the Black Lives Matter marches, right?
Yeah.
There's enough proof for that. There's enough proof of that we shouldn't subject ourselves to these sort of imaginary dividing lines. I hate to use that phrase because division is a triteness of 21st century America. But the dividing lines are imaginary. They're of our own construction. They're cultural constructions, but we also reify them by not participating in other people's struggles. And the struggle for humanity is the only struggle.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you for this. I appreciate it.
It was very nice talking to you.
And that is ACT UP founding member Avram Finkelstein. I should also note that his book I mentioned a few times is called After Silence, and I highly recommend it. Special thank you to the historian Hugh Ryan. He recommended Avram and also connected us. Hugh's been on the show before and also has a brand new essay collection that just came out that is called My Bad, A Personal History of the Queer 90s and Beyond. Now, if you want to see some pictures that I took of Avram and of the Gran Fury images and posters we talked about, I've shared those on our Substack. Our Substack is a free newsletter, and I hope you'll join us there. And yes, if you do want to support our show, you can also sign up as a paid subscriber. But either way, there is a link to our show notes for that. And then next week, our Elder series will be back with our oldest guest yet. It's a person who just turned 100 years old. So I hope you'll join us for that. I'm Jeffrey Masters. I'm on Instagram at JeffMasters1. See you next time.